In a safety emergency, can the police ask a handcuffed suspect accusatory questions without first giving Miranda warnings? To find out, you have to read New York versus Quarles, but it's 20 pages long. Don't have time for that? I've got you covered. This is TLDR, where normally I cover New York Court of Appeals cases in 5 minutes or less, but this is part of a special series I'm doing on landmark cases. This is the episode on the landmark case of New York versus Quarles. The citation for this case is 467 U.S. 649, published by the United States Supreme Court on June 12, 1984. The issue in this case is whether the police are always required to give Miranda warnings before questioning a suspect, even in situations where public safety might be at risk. To better understand this case, a little background is helpful. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution protects a criminal defendant's rights. One of the guarantees of the Fifth Amendment is, no person shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. This means that a person cannot be required to testify against himself at trial. But also in the case of Miranda versus Arizona, the Supreme Court extended the protections of the Fifth Amendment to police interrogations of suspects even before arrest. In the Miranda case, the Supreme Court held that before police may ask questions of a suspect, they have to administer what are now known as Miranda warnings. They have to advise the suspect of the following. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to talk to a lawyer for advice before we ask you any questions. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. And the Miranda case drew a bright line rule. No questioning without Miranda warnings first. But what happens when there's a gun on the loose? What about a ticking bomb? Does the Constitution really tie the hands of the police in those situations? That's the question the Supreme Court grappled with in New York versus Quarles. So what are the facts in this case? The case started in a supermarket in Queens, New York. A woman told a police officer that she'd been raped and that her attacker had just run into the store. She described her attacker and said he had a gun. The officers then entered the store, spotted the defendant who matched the description. When the defendant saw the officers, the defendant ran away from them toward the rear of the store. The officers lost sight of the defendant for a few moments. Eventually, the police confronted the defendant, ordered him to stop, and they discovered that he was wearing a shoulder holster for a gun. But it was empty. The gun was not there. The officers handcuffed the defendant and, without giving any Miranda warnings, asked the defendant where the gun was. The defendant nodded toward some boxes and said, "The gun is over there." The police then searched that area and found the loaded .38 caliber gun. The officers then gave the defendant Miranda warnings and asked more questions about the gun and where he got it from. The defendant answered those questions. The defendant was then prosecuted for criminal possession of a weapon. When defendant moved to suppress the gun and statements, the judge granted the motion. The judge reasoned that Miranda warnings were required to be given before questioning, and they weren't, so the resulting gun and statements should be suppressed. That ruling was challenged and affirmed all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, created a public safety exception to the Miranda rule. They said that if there's an immediate threat to public safety, the police can ask questions designed to secure the scene and neutralize the danger, even before reading Miranda warnings. The court reasoned that the need to protect the public from imminent harm outweighed the need to protect the suspect's Fifth Amendment rights in that moment. The gun, they argued, posed a serious threat to anyone in the supermarket. Not everyone agreed. The dissenting justices argued that creating exceptions to Miranda would weaken it, and ultimately make it harder to protect everyone's constitutional rights. They worried that this decision would give police too much leeway to decide when Miranda didn't apply. The Quarles decision remains controversial to this day. Supporters argue that it gives law enforcement the flexibility they need to do their jobs and keep us safe. Critics worry that it tips the scales too far in favor of law enforcement, and that it comes at the expense of individual rights. One thing is clear. The case forces us to confront a difficult question. When does public safety outweigh individual rights? It's a question with no easy answers, and one that continues to be debated and litigated in courtrooms and classrooms across the country.
If you like what you just saw and want to see more just like it, please hit like or subscribe to let me know.